By the time the storm hit, the crops were dry, the well had run dry, and Clara had not seen her husband in 2 days. With winter bearing down on them and hope withering like the crops, every jar they filled was a lifeline in the unrelenting dust. Before we dive into this story, let us know where you're watching from. If you're drawn to tales of survival, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's story might just outlast this one. It was in the silence that the weight of the land was felt most. Clara had never been one to complain, never one to show the wear and tear of the struggle. Yet, in the calm before the storm, a quiet dread had settled into the bones of her body, gnawing at her like the wind gnawed at the dry earth. The sun had set earlier than usual, swallowed up by the dust clouds that seemed to hang heavier every day. Her children, thin as the dry grass that dotted the prairie, played near the well, the sound of their laughter a rare commodity these days. Her husband, Ben, had gone out 2 mornings ago to fix the irrigation pipes and check the crops. His words echoed in her mind. "I'll be back by the time the sun's high. Shouldn't be too long." But the sun had long since dipped beneath the horizon, and still he hadn't returned. She knew the land well enough to recognize the threat. The storms came with a suddenness that defied logic, fierce as a wild beast and just as unrelenting. Clara's fingers trembled as she worked, sealing jars of vegetables from the last of their crops. Tomatoes, beans, and a few apples, they would be their sustenance when the storms came for everything else. She had learned to preserve what she could, for there was nothing more brutal than watching your labor fade into dust. She filled the jars one by one, sealing each with a practiced hand, not allowing her thoughts to wander to the uncertainty outside. Yet still, she couldn't help but wonder where Ben was and what had delayed him. The wind had picked up again, rustling the trees in the distance, and she knew it wasn't the typical prairie breeze. No, this was something else, the kind of wind that heralded the coming of devastation. Ben was a stubborn man, a trait she admired in him more often than not. But she knew the stubbornness of the land, too, and what it did to those who refused to heed its warnings. She wiped her hands on her apron, the familiar motion giving her a small measure of comfort. With the last of the jars sealed, she moved to the window, peering out into the growing darkness. The storm was close now. The first gust of wind hit like a slap to the face. Clara's heart raced as the familiar sound of the storm grew louder, the wind rising in a howl, carrying with it a relentless, choking dust. Her skin felt dry and cracked as the first grains of dust began to drift into the cabin. She closed the door quickly, but it was no use. The house had no protection from the dust storms that arrived with brutal frequency now. The walls would offer little against the storm that had been brewing on the horizon. She moved to the children, who had already retreated to their small corner, their faces pale with the dust that already clung to their clothes. She had taught them how to breathe shallow, how to cover their mouths and noses with rags, but the dust always found its way inside. It got into everything. Even their food had a bitter, dry taste to it now. Her thoughts again turned to Ben. He should have been back by now. The storm wasn't a surprise. She could see it in the way the sky had darkened and the winds had picked up. He had no choice but to ride out the storm wherever he was. The thought of him exposed out there on the plains made her stomach tighten. She could only pray that his horse had enough strength to outrun the worst of the storm. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of the dust and the fear that clung to it. Clara tried to reassure the children with words she didn't believe herself. "It'll pass soon, we'll be fine. We've weathered worse." But her own voice trembled, betraying the fear she couldn't hide. The storm was here, and nothing could stop it. Not the jars of food that sat, waiting to be cracked open, nor the roof above them that had seen better days. All she could do was wait for the storm to pass and for Ben to return. The storm raged on outside, but inside, the silence was just as heavy, just as oppressive. And with it, a creeping sense of helplessness, of being trapped in a time and place that seemed to be unraveling before her eyes. The storm's fury intensified as night fell. Clara could hear the grinding of the wind against the cabin, a constant and violent percussion that seemed to rattle the very bones of the earth. The children huddled together, their small bodies seeking warmth as they lay under the quilts. Clara tried to keep her own fear at bay, focusing instead on what she could do for them. The cabin's dim light flickered, the kerosene lamp swaying as if it too was afraid of the storm outside. She had set out to make the night feel as normal as possible. She had prepared a simple meal, beans from the jar, bread that she had baked the day before. The smell of warm food should have comforted her, but instead it only highlighted the starkness of the moment. There was no conversation, no laughter to soften the sharp edges of the evening. Only the sound of the storm, the wind scraping against the cabin's walls, and the dry scratch of dust that slipped through the cracks. Clara stared at the wall, her hands folded in her lap, unsure if it was the storm or the uncertainty of Ben's absence that made her feel so still. Her thoughts kept returning to him, replaying the last words he had spoken before leaving for the field. He had promised to return soon, but that promise seemed distant now, swallowed by the howling wind. The kids had long since fallen into a restless sleep, their bodies curling up against the cold air that seeped through the walls, but Clara couldn't rest. She couldn't close her eyes without imagining the worst, Ben lost in the vast, merciless land, unable to find shelter in time. She stood and moved to the window, staring into the swirling dust, trying to catch any sign of him. But all she saw was the darkness, thick and impenetrable. How many hours had passed? How much longer could they wait for the storm to end? She ran her hand over the cold window pane, as if somehow the simple act of touching the glass would bring her closer to him, would bridge the miles that separated them. She knew the storm wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a force of nature that cared little for their fragile lives, their fragile hopes. She had always been strong, the pillar of the family. But tonight, she felt small. The earth beneath her felt unstable. The land she had always called home now an unpredictable enemy. She looked back at her children, the way their small faces were lit by the soft glow of the lamp. They needed her to be strong, needed her to believe that this storm would pass, and that everything would be okay. But in her heart, Clara knew the truth. This wasn't just a storm. It was a warning, a test of endurance. And the land was taking more from them than they could give. As dawn broke the next day, the storm still howled outside, relentless in its attack. Clara had barely slept, her mind tangled in fears for Ben and the exhaustion that came with trying to comfort her children through a night of noise and dust. The air inside the cabin felt thick, stifling, as if the storm had crept into every crack and corner, leaving nothing untouched. But the light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters brought a faint sense of relief. The storm had weakened, though the wind was still fierce, howling as though it were trying to tear apart the world outside. Clara rose from her chair, her stiff muscles protesting, but the need to move, to act, overpowered the weight of exhaustion. She quietly moved over to the children, her fingers brushing their hair as they slept. They were safe, for now. Her thoughts immediately turned back to Ben. She had to get out there, had to search for him, even though the land itself seemed to be against her. But then a sudden noise stopped her cold, a sharp knock on the door, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Clara's heart leaped into her throat, her mind raced, wondering who it could be. She hadn't expected anyone, at least not in the middle of this storm. Could it be Ben? She opened the door cautiously, squinting against the brightness of the early morning light. And there, standing in the doorway, was Ben, dust-covered, weary and thin but alive. He smiled weakly, the weight of the storm still hanging around him like a cloak. He looked as though he had been through hell and back. "Clara." His voice was hoarse, and for a moment, Clara thought she might collapse from the relief that washed over her. Without a word, she pulled him inside, wrapping her arms around him. He was cold, his clothes soaked from the storm, but he was home. She pulled back, her hands resting on his shoulders as she looked into his eyes, searching for answers. "I thought," she began, but her voice broke off. She didn't have the words to express the terror she had felt in the long hours of waiting. "I'm sorry," Ben said, his voice soft. "The storm came fast. We tried to outrun it, but the wind, it was too much. We had to take shelter in the old barn at the edge of the property. I couldn't make it back last night, but I didn't want to leave you wondering." His words reassured her, but there was something else in his eyes. The storm had changed, them both had changed everything. The land they had once trusted had shown its true, unforgiving face, and there would be no going back to the way things were before. Ben sank into the chair by the fireplace, the fire Clara had built crackling softly. She moved to tend to him, bringing him a cup of water, but her mind was already elsewhere. The storm had passed, but the future still loomed uncertain, like the dust that hovered just beyond the horizon. The land was unforgiving, and there was no telling what tomorrow might bring. But for now, Ben was home. That was all she could hold on to. The days that followed the storm were filled with silence. The wind had slowed, the dust settled, and the prairie returned to its usual stillness. But the storm had left more than just its physical marks on the land. It had left an imprint on their hearts, a reminder of how fragile they truly were, how thin the line was between survival and ruin. Clara had never realized how much the land could take until she saw it tear at Ben's spirit. He hadn't spoken much since his return, his exhaustion weighing on him like the dust that still clung to everything they owned. She could see the shadows under his eyes, the stiff way he moved as if he carried something heavier than the storm's remnants. It wasn't just the storm that had shaken him, it was something deeper, something in the air that felt different now. They had survived this time, yes, but for how much longer? The crops were gone, burned by the relentless heat and whipped away by the wind. The well was dry. The earth cracked so wide that even the rain, when it came, couldn't sink deep enough to replenish it. They were running out of options, and Clara knew it. The food they had jarred, the small bits of meat they had stored, the handful of seeds she still kept hidden, none of it would last if the land didn't give them something to work with. Yet still, every morning, Clara rose with the sun, her hands moving through the motions of survival, feeding the children, cleaning the cabin, repairing the fences where the wind had torn them loose. She kept a steady rhythm, as though the physicality of the work might keep the darker thoughts at bay. Ben, though, had taken to the fields again, though he said little about what he hoped to find. The storms, the dry earth, and the dust had broken something in him. He didn't talk much about the days he had spent sheltering in the old barn, huddled with the few remaining animals, but Clara could see it in the way he handled the work now. He wasn't the man who had left for the fields, eager to claim their land, to wrestle from the earth all it could offer. Now he was quieter, more withdrawn, and the fire she once saw in him seemed to have dimmed. Even his pride, the thing that had kept him fighting so long, seemed to falter. The weight of their decisions pressed on Clara as well. They had made it through the worst of the storm, but the road ahead didn't look any easier. There was always the risk of another dust storm, another wave of heat, or worse, a total failure of crops. There was no way of knowing what would come next. One afternoon, after she had finished checking the children's health for signs of dust-related illness, Clara sat by the window staring out at the fields. The emptiness stretched in all directions, as far as her eyes could see. Nothing grew here anymore, nothing but dust and dead earth. And yet the land still held them, bound them to it with some invisible tether. She thought of the neighbors, those who had left long ago for other towns, for safer lands, and she wondered if they'd made the right choice. Ben returned after a long day in the field, his face drawn and tired. He stopped by the door, the weight of the world on his shoulders, and looked out into the barren horizon. Clara watched him, unsure of what to say. There were no more comforting words, no easy reassurances left. All they had was each other. But even that seemed like it might slip away if they didn't find a way forward. "I've been thinking," Ben said quietly, his voice hoarse. "Maybe it's time to go. Maybe we should leave." The words hung in the air, fragile as glass. Clara's heart sank. She had known this was coming, felt it in the silence that had settled between them. But hearing it aloud made it real, and for a moment she couldn't find her voice. The land, the cabin, the life they had fought for, it was all slipping through her fingers. "You're saying we give up?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," Ben replied, his gaze firm but tired. "I'm saying we survive. We don't have to stay here to die. There's nothing left for us in this dust." The truth of his words struck her with the force of a slap. There was nothing left. The crops were gone, their savings dwindling, and each day that passed felt like it was draining them of what little hope they had left. She wanted to argue, to scream at him that they had fought too hard to walk away, but she knew he was right. Maybe it was time to go. But the question still lingered in her mind, where would they go? The world outside the prairie had changed, just as much as they had. The cities were full of people with nowhere to go, and the roads were as barren as their land. But perhaps, just perhaps, there was a place they could find. A place where the land wasn't so unforgiving, where the air didn't sting with dust, and where their children could grow strong. "We leave," Clara said, her voice steady despite the uncertainty inside. "We leave together. We take what we have, and we go." Ben looked at her then, a mixture of relief and sorrow in his eyes. He nodded slowly, as though coming to terms with the decision they had both known was inevitable. The road ahead was unclear, but they would walk it together, and perhaps that was enough for now.